he sent them like, I get enough emails. So at one point,
you give these people permission, they become nudniks.
yeah. So at one point, he jumped the shark, as they say. There's an expression when you take things way too far. So at one point, I couldn't handle it anymore. I agreed with his position to a point, but then he went like way, way extreme.
Yeah.
And I got the emails were getting ridiculous. The volume and the snoring. The snoring.
Right. Yeah, I look at it for its entertainment value.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're holding in the middle of a sugya where Rav said that if one has an asham that becomes disqualified from being an asham for one out of 5 reasons. So what's supposed to happen is it's supposed to be put out to pasture till it gets a mum. Then when it gets a mum, it is sold. And then you buy with it an oil. However, what happens if someone didn't wait till it got a mum and he shechted it stam? Do we say that it automatically becomes an oila? By default, it transfers into an oila because that's really what it's destined to be. Zokra, yes, it does. So, Frek the Gemara, based on this concept that whenever a carbon's purpose changes, it doesn't need a specific declaration to change it. It could just shift automatically. So let's look at our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, we had a case where someone shechted a carbon Pesach, l'shem the carbon Pesach. And after he shechted it, he found out that either all of its owners were tummy, or all of its owners released their registration. So he shechted out a possible carbon Pesach. The halach is the carbon is possible. The question is, why would you say the carbon is possible? According to Rav, where once the carbon Pesach is no longer able to be a carbon Pesach, it would automatically transfer and become a carbon shlomim, even without my declaration. So this carbon should be kosher. The problem is not only did the Mishnah say it's possible, a brisa expanding on the Mishnah says that this must be burnt right away. And there is a halacha that if there's a psul haguf in a carbon, if the carbon is internally damaged, then you burn it right away. But if it's really a good carbon, there's an external technical reason why the carbon went bad, then you can't just burn it. It's a bezoin for kachim. Rather, one must wait until this becomes noisar. Noisar is already a psul haguf, and then once it becomes noisar, the next day you could burn it. Now, the brisa said about this case with the carbon Pesach that you burn it right away. But according to Rav, that when the carbon Pesach became disqualified from being a carbon Pesach, it automatically transferred to becoming a carbon shlomim. So then why is there a psul? I shechted a carbon shlomim. It doesn't have to have a specific owner. Elamai, the problem must be, is you shechted this carbon shlomim during the time where all the carbon Pesachs are being shechted. And that would be after the Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim. And a carbon that's shechted after the Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim is possible. So that's why this carbon would be possible. But that's not a psul haguf. That's a technical problem. If that's the case, why does the brisa say that you burn this carbon right away if it's not Shabbos? The brisa should say that you have to uber tzurosa, means you have to wait until it becomes nicer, and only then could you burn it. That was the problem that we had. Since Rav says that carbonis will automatically transfer into the carbon that they're allowed to be without you declaring it, this is a shlomim. If this is a shlomim, the only psul that it could be, that could have, is that it was shechted after the Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim, which is a technical problem, and that should not allow it to be burnt right away, like the brisa says. That should make the halacha that you have to leave it until it becomes nicer, and only then you burn it. That was the problem. So the Gemara attempted yesterday to say, you know what, Rav didn't mean it happens automatically. Rav meant you actually have to specifically declare it, which means in our Mishnah, the Pesach remained a Pesach, And that's where there's a psul guf. But Dr. Moore, you can't say that that's what Rav meant, because on Samach Dalid, Reb Chia bar Gamda made it very clear from the Mishnah that the only time you say that a Pesach retains its status of a Pesach and doesn't automatically change it to becoming a Shlomim is if this Korban Pesach was owned by someone who became Tameh, and he's planning to use the same Korban for next month for Pesach Sheni. So there you say that the Korban retains its status of a Korban Pesach. But any other Korban Pesach that became possible for any other reason will automatically transfer into being a Shlomim. So if that's the case, we're back to square one. If this Korban is automatically a Shlomim, then the only psul that we can attribute to this Korban is the fact that it was shechted after the Korban Tomid Shal Bein Harbayim, which is only a technical psul, which would require that first you have to let it become nicer and then you could burn it. But our Brisa says that you burn it right away. That was the problem that we finished off with yesterday. So I believe that we're up to the middle of the Amid, Ella Amar Rav Huna. So Ella Amar Rav Huna Bared Rabbi Yeshua, Hacha b'may askinu. I'm going to tell you why here there was actually a psul haguf as well. What happened is what is the significance of Chatzois on Erev Pesach? Chatzois is the time when you're allowed to start bringing Korban Pesach. Or otherwise said, Chatzois is the time where the chiyuv to bring your Korban Pesach is activated. So Chatzois is when it says live on the screen. Now we got to bring the Korban Pesach. It's not theoretical anymore. Now's the zone. Now's the time to do it. So what happened was going to your future Korban Chatzois. You have a Korban Pesach that was designated before Chatzois. Usually it's even designated several days earlier. So this is ready to go, but the time didn't come yet where it's triggered. So Chatzois arrived, and now this is an active Korban Pesach. And after it became an active Korban Pesach, then the Bailam died. The Havaleh, that makes it that this Korban was nira, because once it's a Korban Pesach designated and it's already in the Chiyuv zone, so that's like a Korban Pesach almost in process. So it was right there as a Korban Pesach, v'nitche. And after it was already in the system, then it lost its status because its Bailam died, and now it became possible. Zokt Rav, his own Chiddush. It's not Rav speaking. It's Rav Huna Rabbi Yeshua wants to say, anything that was once good and then it lost its hechsher could never go back to becoming nira again. So in this case, when Chatzois arrived, this was still a Korban Pesach. So it retained its status of Korban Pesach, and then it was nitche. Such a Korban can't just slide over to becoming a shlom. This is a nir of a nitche, that's a psul haguf, and therefore it makes sense to say that you have to burn it right away. Fact more, it's a beautiful swara you said, but we're trying to explain the shita of Rav. Midihu taima el Rav, right? Rav was the one who started this whole controversy because Rav is the one who said that the oshum automatically changes to becoming an oila. Rav said an animal that's alive will never become nitche. The only time some psul can occur in an animal that will make it possible forever, that's only if it's after it was already shechted. That's called in the process of being a korban. But just because we're in the active time to bring the Korban Pesach, till I shech that Korban Pesach, it's not nearer to the point that it becomes nitche in ganzen. So we're back to square one. Why is it that the Brisa says that this Korban Pesach, which should have automatically shifted into becoming a Korban Shlomim, which only has the psul that it was shechted after the Tomid Shal Bein Harbayim, why is it burnt right away? Why don't we say you have to wait till it becomes noiser to Uber Tzurasam and then we'll burn it? El Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa wants to come up with a different solution. Hamani Rabbi Eliezer. Let's say that our Mishnah and our Brisa that says it needs to be burnt is following the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. And Rashi tells us that here it's speaking, and it's logical to say that that's the case, that when I shechted this korban, I shechted it specifically l'shem Pesach. So now what I have is, I have a carbon shlomim, because the way Rav understands it, the moment all the people, all the owners die, it shifted to become a shlomim, and I shechted it l'shem Pesach. So our Mishnah tells us, what happens if you have a shlomim that you shecht l'shem Pesach? The halacha is, that's possible. And Rabbi Eliezer says, the Omar, if you shechted a shlomim l'shem Pesach, possible, it's possible. And he adds, he holds that, makes it into a psula guf. If you shecht a shlomim beferish l'shem Pesach, that makes it a psula guf. So that's easy now. This shlomim, it became an automatic shlomim because the Bailam died, yet the shoichet shechted it specifically l'shem Pesach. That's a psul into of itself, and that's why you can burn it right away. Frek the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer cannot be the Tana of our Mishnah, because we know Rabbi Eliezer said, "The Rabbi Eliezer he chatas nami mechayiv." The less than the Rabbi Eliezer Torah b'dvar mitzvah poter. Rabbi Eliezer held in our Mishnah that if someone shechted a carbon shlomim l'shem a carbon chatas by ru'uyin, where it's logical that you could have mixed it up because it was an animal that was royu to be a carbon chatas. Rabbi Eliezer holds that even though it's tov b'dvar mitzvah, but also mitzvah kol dehu, you chayv chatas. Yet our Mishnah, when it discusses the case of someone who shechted a carbon pesach, whose bailam died, it doesn't say you need to bring a carbon pesach, a carbon chatos for it, if this was done on Shabbos. So Rabbi Eliezer cannot be the Tana of our Mishnah. So the svara of saying that shechting it l'shem pesach is a psula guf because it was a shlomim, that's a good svara. But who says that svara? Rabbi Eliezer. We know for sure Rabbi Eliezer is not the Tana of our Mishnah. Ela tigul Rabbi Yosef of Salah Chasida, I have no problem because I found another Tana who also says it's a psula guf, but it's not Rabbi Eliezer. So he's not shackled, burdened by the psak that you're chayv chatos. So it's not Rabbi Eliezer, but it's a different Tana who holds that shechting a shlomim l'shem Pesach is also a psula guf. The Tigam Rabbi Yosef of Salah Chasida Kamedi Papa Hamani Yosef ben Chunoi. Our Mishnah could follow the sheet of Yosef ben Chunoi. That nan Yosef ben Chunoi ever hanishchot l'shem Pesach u'l'shem chatos. If you shechted a shlomim l'shem Pesach or l'shem chatos, psulim they're possible. A psule begufi. So you see, he also holds there's a psula guf u'mishum hachi yisarf miyad. That's why the Brisa explains our Mishnah and says that if this occurred on the weekday, if such a psula guf occurred on the weekday, you would burn it right away. And I don't have the problem that you should be chai v'chatos, because uvavturei sovelok Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yosef bar Chanoi could hold like Rabbi Yeshua, so our Mishnah will hold like Rabbi Yeshua in that prat, that if you shechted a shlomim l'shem Pesach, it's close enough that it's an honest enough mistake where we'll say that he's potter from a carbon chatos. So that's the maskana. That's the maskana. Rav holds, and we hold that if you shecht if you shecht this carbon pesach, which was not right to be a carbon pesach, because all of the bailim have already withdrawn from it, or they became tomei, it automatically transitions to becoming a shlomim. And in our Mishnah, the reason why it's possible is because our Mishnah holds that if you shecht a shlomim l'shem pesach, that in and of itself is a psula guf, and that's why the Brisa comments on our Mishnah and says that this needs to be burnt right away. It does not have to be left to become nicer.
Yes,
this is the maskana.
Just a quick question. Do these bailam that became tamei or died, does that have to happen before he shechted it? Like what happens if they die?
If it happens after he shechted it, then the carbon will be a good carbon.
But no one's eating it.
Yeah, it'll become possible later. But his shchita didn't make it possible. Maybe you won't be able to make the zrika on it. But if I'm not mistaken, once you shecht it, you're automatically registered. So you cannot withdraw anymore. Now, if you became tomei, that's a different story. So if after the shchita everyone became tomei, it will probably passel the carbon. But nevertheless, that's not what we're discussing in the Mishnah.
Right. Okay.
Okay, Zok Tehillah Gemara. So now that we have Pshat in the Mishnah, the Gemara wants to try to propose an alternative Pshat, which will not work out. So Rav Ashi Omar Rav, the Omar, Rav Shmuel, B'no Shal Birchim Ben Berek. Yes, there is a brisa that comments on our Mishnah that says Yisaref Miyad. And yes, according to Rav, where this Pesach automatically became a Shlomim, so then the only problem that we might have here is the fact that he was shechted after the Karban Toma Shal Ben Arbayim, and that should not say Yisaref Miyad. That should say that you have to wait till it becomes nicer. Ein Yechadami, that's true. The brisa that says Yisaref is a different shita, but there's a different brisa we're going to quote from Reb Shmuel B'noi, who argues, and in fact holds in our Mishnah, you don't burn it right away. It's to Uber to Rush, and you wait till it becomes nicer, and only then can you burn it. Titania, Rabbi Shmuel B'noi Shal Rabbi Yochanan Mabreka Eimer, Yeshos B'yoyim Leda Imashchu Bailim Mishadeim Oishemesu Oishenitmu. What if there was time that the Shoichet could have investigated to confirm that he still has a Karban Pesach here that's valid, that everyone's still involved, then he'd be chayav chatas. But this is the most important part. What happened in this case? You shechted this animal as a Pesach when it was really a shlomim, and therefore you're shechting a shlomim, and the only psul involved is that you've shechted it after the Talmud Shal Ben Arbayim, to uber tzurasoi. So this is very beautiful. This is exactly what Rav would learn is the halacha here. My time, what would be the reasoning for Rabbi Shmuel B'noi Shel Rabbi Yochanan Bereka that it's to uber tzurasoi? It's lav mishum v'leiboy akira. It must be because he holds in this case where you shechted this Karban Pesach and it was already possible, it automatically becomes a shlamim, which is exactly how he reasoned. So to Gemara, that would be wrong shot in this brisa. Mimai, why are you insisting that this brisa holds that it automatically becomes a shlomim, and that's why it's to ubar tzurasa? Dilma mishum desover law. Maybe there's a different reason for this brisa, and maybe it's because of Shmuel B'noi Shel Rabbi Yochanan Bereka holds like ketana devei Rabba Baravu. The Omar afilu pigol nami boy iber tzura. Rabba Baravu holds the brisa that Rabba Baravu quoted holds that every single psul in the book, it doesn't matter if it's a psul aguf, it doesn't matter if it's not a psul aguf, every psul in the book, you never burn until it becomes nicer. So that has nothing to do with our shayla. The aleph, where would you get such an idea from? Oven min nicer. It says oven in the parsha of Pigel, which is as psul aguf as you can get. It says oven by nicer. And we learn, just like by nicer, you don't burn it until it becomes nicer, because that's what it is. So too, every other psul aguf, you only burn it once it becomes nicer. And that's got to be pshat in Rabbi Shmuel B'noi Shel Rabbi Yochanan Ben Bereka, and not like you're suggesting because it wasn't a psul aguf. If you're not going to learn pshat in the brisa like that, one of the cases that Rabbi Shmuel lists off as to uber tzurasoi is nitmu habayim. Now let's think about it. If it's nitmu habayim, there even Rav would be moided that you need to make an akira. You need to specifically say this is no longer a Pesach, it's a shlom. Havade boy akira, like we said earlier. Amar Abchia bar Gamda, Nizur kam b'pichabura, kadon shayu bayim tmei meis v'nitchul Pesach sheni. Pshat in this brisa is that you had an animal that became tamei. Sorry, you had an animal that the bailim became tamei, and now these bailim want to retain its status of a Karban Pesach because they want to use it for Pesach Sheni. So there, even Rav would be moida that you have to officially declare it as a shlam. In this case, you didn't. So according to Rav, this would for sure be a case where you burn right away. So how could you explain in our brisa here why Rabbi Shmuel says even there is to uber tzurasoi? It must be because it's a special halacha that he holds that every single psul in the book, you always have to wait till it becomes nicer. So now I don't have this teretz anymore. So the pshat in the Mishnah has to be is that if you shech a shlomim l'shem Pesach, is considered a psul aguf, and that's why it's yisoref miyad. Okay, now we're getting in to shilas of bishul and taruvis and mulicha, because we're getting into the nitty gritty of preparing the carbon pesach. So to hey, look at the more. How do you roast a pesach? How do you set up the barbecue? So you take a shvut shel rimon, you take a spit, not of metal, but out of wood from a pomegranate tree. You sharpen it up and you step it into the mouth of the animal. It literally goes right through it till the other side. The V'noisen eskrov. Now the Mefarshim tell us that the point goes through the mouth, comes out the back, but the other end of the stick is thicker, so that when you stand it up and if the head of the animal is pointed down, you're standing it up, it doesn't slide off because it's thicker.
I just want to be clear. So the emurim were already removed. All of the innards were removed. Correct. Isn't there a pasuk that says that you have to roast it with the kishkas inside?
It would be impossible because the emurim are brought onto the mizbeach.
What are
we're going to discuss the kishkas. The kishkas we do keep. The kishkas we might keep. But the chalav, most of the chalavim are the organs.
So that's removed. That was stripped, and the skin was also removed.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
So what are the amurim exactly? What does that include?
So there's the different chalavim that's around the organs, right? There's a chalav, kerev. But there's a lot of the intestines and even the organs that you don't put on the mizbeach, but it's mostly the chalavim.
So okay, so that's removed, and then you have to close up the body somehow, don't you?
I don't think they actually sewed it closed. They left it a body cavity that they left open, I think.
Well, how does it not just spill out all over the place?
I would guess that when they normally take out a murin, they slice open the animal's belly up until the rib cage, but there's still the rib cage area that remains enclosed that could hold everything.
Okay.
Because they only sliced open the stomach until the rib cage.
So they reached in. But there's plenty of kishkas still left that could.
So I guess the rib cage area would have been able to contain, because it seems like they hung it with its head down, so therefore the rib cage area would have formed some type of receptacle that would have contained everything, because it doesn't say anywhere that they tied it closed.
Yeah.
So the niceness.
Wondering how this technically happened, because we seem to be left with a few technical issues about how it was transported back to where I imagine all the Korban Pesach were done just all around the Beis Hamikdash, all these bonfires, Har Zeisim, and
excuse me. Well, the Gemara tells us earlier they wrapped it up in its skin. They used its skin as a bag to carry their whole package.
Oh, they wrapped it up. Okay, I missed that part.
They wrapped it in its skin. That's how they brought it to their barbecue. But once they put it in the barbecue, I can't imagine they left the skin on.
Mm-hmm. No, I imagine that also. Okay.
But there is a fair amount of space in the ribcage area to hold most of the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's see what happens. Its legs and its intestines, like you mentioned, actually were thrown inside the cavity, and that's how they were burnt. Not that they weren't burnt. That's how they were roasted. If you don't have even these parts directly in the flame, they're just sitting in a pot, but the pot happens to be made out of the rib cage of the animal. That's like bishul, so that wouldn't be allowed. Rather, you hang it outside of the animal, you put it on the shish kebab further down the line. Now, there's a shaila as to how to understand the machlekes Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Akiva, because if you think about it, every piece of meat that you roast, it's only the outermost surface that's in the fire. If it's a piece of meat that's 2 inches thick, so 1 inch might be, or even half an inch might be in the flame, but the rest of it is weiter inside the cavity, which you could also refer to as kamin bishul. So according to Rabbi Akiva, that says something inside the animal's kamin bishul, so then it's ain't a davar soif, even the meat itself. Elamai, when the Torah says kiyum tzliesh, the Torah means tzliation. The normal way to make tzli is to roast meat. And of course, not all the meat's going to be directly exposed to the flame. It's a normal roasting. So the machlekes between Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Akiva could be if the Torah was makbid on even these intestines, or if that's called kederach tzli, that you put it inside. That's what the Torah meant. That it's kederach tzli. That's one pshat that they offer. Another pshat that they offer is tzli kader, when it's roasted in a pot. Now we have a minig not to eat roasted meat Pesach by night, so it shouldn't look like we're eating kosher b'chutz. What about tzli kader? Are you allowed to make something on the stove but not cooked? The minig is people only eat cooked food on Pesach by night. People don't use it roasted, even if it was roasted in a pan. People don't do it. So could be that would also be the shaila over here is tzli kader. If it's roasted but it's in a vessel, is that considered tzli or not? Rabbi Akiva might hold not, and Rabbi Yosy might hold yes. Ein tzolin as a Pesach lo yal ashpud. You're not allowed to roast Korban Pesach on a metal pole, and the Gemara is going to tell us why. Because metal conducts heat, so that the metal pole, even inside the meat, is going to get hot, and that's going to cook the meat around it. V'lo yal askala, not on a grill. Omer Abtzadik, Ma'aser ber Gamliel. She'amar lo Tavi Avdoi, say utzlanu as a Pesach, utzlei lanu as a Pesach alal askala. Rabbi Gamliel told Tevi that he should use the askala, meaning clearly Rabbi Gamliel held that a grill was okay. The shaila is, isn't there halacha mitzvah boy yoshim imishluchai? Don't you find on Erev Shabbos, the Gemara tells us, but all these Amayroim who were makbid to do the preparation for Shabbos themselves? So why is it that Rabbi Gamliel would delegate the preparing of the Korban Pesach to his Evet, so that those who learn that there's a specific mitzvah in preparing for Shabbos, that he would do by himself, but there's no specific mitzvah to prepare the Korban Pesach, mitzvah is to eat the Korban Pesach. So therefore, he would have delegated it to his Evet. Frank the Gemara, why do you use a wooden post? Why don't you use a metal pole as a spit with which to roast animal? We know metal is a very good conductor of heat. Even if the edges of the stick are in the flame, it's going to make the whole metal stick very hot inside. The kamatfi machmas hashpud, and the inner part of the animal is going to get roasted from the heat of the steel of the spit. It's only allowed to be roasted by fire, not from some other conductor. Why does it have to be of a rimoin tree? Why can it be a palm tree? So a palm tree has grooves in it that will allow moisture from the tree to be released, and that moisture is going to get hot, and that's going to cook the meat in its immediate area. So take the wood of a fig tree. The fig tree has a soft, marrowish type of substance that's liquid. Like you find a lot of vegetation, if you cut it, moisture comes out of it, like lettuce. So this has a similar property. Mabak Maya, once again, it releases water. Take from a tree of a boxer tree. Vishal shikma is a different type of tree that we learned about not too long ago. They have knots. Trees that have knots are a problem. Mapik Maya. And the reason why they'll be mapik Maya is you need a smooth stick, otherwise you can't strip it into the animal. So you're going to sand down those knots to make them smooth. Once you chopper with the bark and you open it up, again, it's going to ooze some type of sap, and that's also going to create a problem of bishul in those areas. The rimon tree also has knots in it, so you have the same problem. So no, she kitri. The knots on a rimon tree are much smoother. They don't need to be sanded down, and therefore we won't have a problem of it releasing liquid. But the knots of the charuf tree or the shikma tree, they would have to be sanded down and smoothed out, and that would expose us to the problem of moisture. Navga barshata. We're not speaking about any old rimon tree. We're talking about a rimon tree that's less than a year old. And therefore, the lespe kitri, that doesn't have any knots yet. That's completely smooth. At the end of the day, you had to cut it. If you had to cut it, that area of the cut is going to ooze out moisture. So tomorrow, the mapet live paske lebar. You make sure that the cut is not inside the animal, it's out of the animal. So therefore, the animal won't be exposed to that area that might secrete some sound. Zok Gemara, Maslisim like Rabbi Yehuda. Our mission disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that there's no problem with using a steel stick. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda, just like the split of eights doesn't get burnt inside the animal, so too, it doesn't get hot. So what is Rabbi Yehuda's shita? When you hang this wooden stick in the oven and it's covered over with a tle, of course, because that's what it's going through, the part that's inside the tle the wood that's inside the tle doesn't get burnt, because the tle shields it from the heat. The metal inside doesn't get hot. From the heat of the stick, of the pole, the metal pole that's sticking out. They told him, by a metal, we know it conducts. So if it becomes hot, if the metal becomes hot outside of the animal, the heat's going to conduct through the entire metal pole. I'm sorry, Dovi, you were saying something.
So they're arguing in Mitzias.
That's what I'm struggling with, because we all know metal does conduct heat.
Right.
But it must be that for sure we'll agree that even though metal conducts heat, it's not going to be, the pole will not be as hot in the center as it will be at the edges that are exposed to the fire. So maybe the question is, the amount of heat that does get conducted, is that enough to say that this is called tzli machmas shvud and not tzli machmas eish? Because I don't think anybody can argue and say metal doesn't conduct heat. It very much does. Okay. Zok tehel gemor vayter. V'noisen krov. If anybody ever walked up to your stove, and if your wife left a spoon in a pot of hot food, if you try touching the edge of the spoon, you're going to burn yourself. And the spoon in the pot, the edge of the spoon is not dipped in to the heat. V'noisen krov. Tanya Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Shmuel used to refer to this. He used to call this method, this configuration, tuch tuch. He would call tuch tuch. Why would they call tuch tuch? Part is inside, because you put the knees inside. But Rashi has a different approach. Rashi says it's called tuch tuch because as the knees and the head inside, as the knees and the b'nei ma'ayin inside cook, you hear the sound tuch tuch. That's the cooking sound. Kekoil hasir. That's the sound of the cooking, and that's where it gets the lashon tuch tuch from. Lishna achrina chasav v'sarim. It's toich ubar. It's tuch bar, meaning it's toich kabaroi, meaning it's getting nice and hot inside. So that's why Rabbi Shmuel called this method the tuch tuch method. We had this earlier about a dimakulus, about that person who would allow everybody to make a dimakulus Pesach night. So dimakulus means the beautiful, makulus means the most choshev type of roasting. Why was it a choshev type of roasting? Because all those pieces were put on the stick below the head. which means that it looked like the head of the animal was wearing a helmet, so it looked like he was a knight, and that way that's one of the reasons why it's called a gdimikulus. Zok tehele gemara vayter. Taner Rabban, ezuk gdimikulus. What is a gdimikulus? The osir lechol b'leila pesach b'zman hazeh, that we no longer are going to eat b'zman hazeh because it looks like we're eating kosher mechutz. It's kol shetzoloi kulekech. That's only if the whole animal was roasted as one unit. But nechtach mimenu ever. What if a leg was cut off and was not roasted with it, or nishlach mimenu ever, or one leg rather than being roasted was cooked? Ein zeh gdimikulus. That is no longer gdimikulus. Zok Gemara makes no sense. Hashtu yishlemin nechtach mimenu ever. In the case where one of the Evorim was cut off, what did you do with that cut off Eivor? You roasted it as well. You just didn't roast it together with the rest of the animal because it was a separate piece. The Avagav the Kavatavale Bade, even though you're still roasting it together, Amrit Loi, you're saying it's no longer Gdimikulus because it's separated from the animal, from the base of the animal. Well, the Nishlak Boy, if you cooked it, you for sure separated it. So if I separated an limb and I roasted it, that's possible. So for sure, if I separated a limb and I cooked it, for sure that would be, for sure that not, it's not possible. For sure that would not be considered agdimikulus. No, this is not disconnected. I don't know how you did it exactly, but you took the whole animal and the animal roasted, and one leg of it you dropped into a pot. So actually, while the rest of the animal was being roasted, this limb got cooked, and it was remaining connected the whole time. That's also not going to be a gdimikulus. Amar Rabba, Haimul Yasa Shori. They used to, Rashi tells us, they used to fillet a little bit, separate the meat from the bone, and then they would stick into that cavity another layer of meat. So Rashi is so when we stuff chicken nowadays, when my wife stuffs chicken, she puts it between the skin and the meat of the chicken. Or if it's like a Cornish hen, it would be in the interior. But in those days, they used to separate, create a cavity between the meat and the bone, and they would put another layer of meat inside. Shari, that's mutter, and this is not a discussion of Pesach. This is a discussion of when you have to salt it, because otherwise the blood's going to get absorbed. So Rashi Shari, Vafilu Loi, it's very important that we change the Girsha. Afilu Loi Molchu as a basar. Well, let's read the Dalet because it's very relevant to the touch. Vafilu Loi Molchu as a basar shenoisnin l'soicha. Even though the meat that you inserted there into the other meat, even though you never salted it, when they make tzli, they salt it lightly. When you're actually preparing meat to cook, like our butchers do, they put on a heavy layer of salt to extract the blood. So this piece of meat that you shoved inside the other meat, even if you didn't properly salt it as if it was going to be cooked, before you put it in, rather it was just lightly salted, so you might argue that dam is going to leave that piece of meat and it's going to get into the meat around it, and therefore it should make it usher al stam. It's not a problem, you're allowed to use it. How is it mutter? The area around it, you have a separate piece of meat that's shoved into the basar atleh, in between its meat and its bone. Blood's going to go out of that piece of meat. It's going to get absorbed into the main meat, and then it'll be usher al stam. Sok to Gemara, I'll tell you why it's not a problem. Because since it's there in the fire, the same way that the heat's going to cause blood to go from this piece of meat into the animal, that heat's going to cause it also to drain out of the animal, and therefore, after it's done, you're not going to have a problem of any remaining dam. Let's say we could bring a raya from our Mishnah to this halacha. Again, you're stuffing the cavity of the animal with other meat. My time, how could that be allowed? Why won't there be a problem of it absorbing blood? It must be because we hold of the sheet of kaboila kach poeltoi, and therefore it won't be a problem. From there, you don't have a raya. Ami shiny hasam, even the iga base shchita de mechalchal. How is this put into the fire? It's put in upside down with its head down. So the cut, what's bleeding, is face down. So made of divey, we say that it all runs right out. When you have it prepared and configured in the flame in such a way where the neck's open and all the blood's running down, that's not, you don't need kaboy lekach poiltoi. There, the meat never absorbs any dam because it's just running out. It's never captured. It just runs right out. Okay, so let's try to find another raya that you say kaboy lekach poiltoi. Halev, when you prepare the lave, the heart of an animal to eat, you tear it open, and you allow its dam to drain out. What if you didn't do that? Then after you cook it, and Rashi says, so after you roast the heart, you slice it open, and that would also wouldn't be a problem. My time. How could you possibly explain why there's no problem? It's full of blood. It must be that we hold which will be a right to milyasa that it should be allowed as well. So shiny leg the shia. A heart is very smooth and rigid, and therefore it will not be beleya. And Rashi's even if you cooked it that way, it wouldn't be a problem because heart meat is very hard and smooth, and it will not allow blia. Even though you don't necessarily say kaboy lekach. And it's this svar of Shia that leads to a machloikis rishonim if glass is beleya. Glass, there are those who learn that glass is not beleya, like the machaber, because it's Shia, it's very hard and very smooth. There are more holds that glass could be beleya. And as a matter of fact, this machloikis led to an interesting story between the Balatanya. The Balatanya couldn't afford a becher, so he brought his regular glass from all year, being soymech on the mechaber to the Seder by the Mesutcha Magid. The Mesutcha Magid couldn't make Kiddush because he said that the Ramah was in the room protesting the person that's violating the Ramah's shita that you're not allowed to use a glass because a glass will be balei. There are those who learn that this chumrah of not using glass only applies to Pesach, but milchiks and fleishiks wouldn't be a problem. So there's a shaila about how glass works. Anyway, the Ravin Saba, Tafle Ahu Bar Gozla Larav. He created a dough. He made like a krepel. He wrapped a small bird with dough, prepared it for Rav. He told him, Imala Tafle, if that dough wrapper tastes good, if it's geshmak, Havli ve'echo, please give me some, and I'll eat it. So once again, you see kabbalah kach poeltai, because for sure the dough around the meat is going to absorb blood. Yet Rav still wanted to eat it. It must be because kabbalah kach poeltai. So no, achib is smida the mafir. This was not a dough; it was a batter, and it's a batter. Rashi says be'isa shal soilas. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Rashi learns it's a dough. Tosfos learns it's a batter. The Gemara's teretz of ahibas smida is something else. The Gemara's teretz of ahibas smida is we're talking about the type of flour that doesn't stick well and it crumbs. The mafer, it crumbs. So therefore, it will never trap the blood in any way. So you don't need kabbalah kach. It'll run right out. They prepared for him a goose that was also wrapped in dough. They cooked his goose. Amar, he said, if I didn't see that the dough around it is clear, like a white glass, and there's no remnant of red or blood in it, I would not have eaten it. So you see, in fact, that there's a problem. If you hold kabbalah kach poeltoi, why did he have to see that it's completely clear? I feel like even if it wasn't perfectly clear and it had some reddish tinge, it should still be mutter al kabbalah kach poeltoi, and you would say that the reddish tinge is merely a juice and it's not blood if you hold it a sheet of kabbalah kach poeltoi. So tomorrow hasam Bechivrsa the sharir. Once again, Rashi says it was kemach nakia, which is not soilus, and that's very the sharir kosher in a poultry. It's a type of dough made out of a flour that would be very rigid and hard, and there you don't take a boil of poultry, similar to the heart. The hilchos halacha l'maisa. This midah, if it's made of flour, that's midah, which we said cracks and becomes crumbs, so it wouldn't contain any blood anyway. Whether or not it became red or not, it doesn't matter, because we will say it's moil, it's not dam. If it's flour that's a harder flour, then izig kazuzah chivr shari. If it's clear and it doesn't have a reddish tinge in it, then you'll say it's mutter. But iloy aser. And the shar kamachim, other types of flours, asmik aser. If it became reddened, then it's going to be aser. Loy asmik shari. But if it wasn't, then it's going to be mutter. Hi Melisa. Going back to the Melisa. Manda osar. If you hold that Melisa is aser, then it's afilu puma l'sachas. Even if the opening is face down when it's cooking, so Rashi says, I'm sorry, puma l'sachas is when the opening is down, so any blood will run out. If you hold it's aser, it's even aser in that case. And if you hold it's mutter, even if the opening is up, so the blood doesn't easily drain out. If you hold it to mutter, it'll be mutter even if you roasted it in such a configuration. And we paskin, in fact, that it's going to be mutter, regardless. Rashi says, shari, even though no blood can get out, it's going to be mutter, because we hold even though it can't just run out, the heat is going to end up drawing the blood out of the whole combined dish over here, and it'll be mutter. Reddened meat that's absorbed with blood. Bay means the beitzim of an animal. They used to eat them. Umizruki, and the arteries that go through the neck of the animal, which have a lot of blood in them. Pligibo ravacha v'ravina b'chol ha'tarakula. Pligibo ravacha v'ravina. B'chol ha'tarakula, anywhere in the Torah where you find a machloikis that's exclusively between Rav Acha and Ravina, and the Gemara doesn't say what Rav Acha held and what Ravina held, you could assume any time in the Torah, anytime you find such a machlokes, that Rav Acha was the Chomer and Ravina was the Kul. So whenever the Gemara doesn't identify who said what, you can always assume Ravina was the Mekel. And v'hilchos Ravina l'Kula. And in all Shas, when you have a machlokes and Ravina's Mekel, you pass on like Ravina. Levar Mahanit Klas, except for these three cases that we just listed off, to Rav Acha l'Kula. Here Rav Acha is Mekel, and Ravina l'Chomer, and Ravina is Machmer. The hilchos Rav Acha l'Kula, but once again we pass on l'Kula. Ha'um to the aspect, you have reddened meat. If you cut it up and you salted it, then afilu look there, shari, then it's going to be mutter even to cook. Shafte v'shvuda, if you didn't salt it, you just roasted it on the spit, shari will be mutter because made of dye. If you say that the blood drips out. Achte agumri, but if you prepared it by throwing it on coals, they're pligabar Rav Acha Ravina. Chad asar v'chad shari. Manda asar, it's matzmis samas. When you put it on the coals, it's going to quickly seal up and retain its blood. That'll be a problem. Manda shari mishav shayv, holds that the fire will draw the blood out, and therefore it will be mutter. V'hilchas mishav shav l'kula, in this case like Rav Acha. V'chein bay, same thing with the beitzim of an animal. Chetchinu u'melchinu, if you cut them open and salt them, I feel like they're shari and you're allowed to cook them. Talinu b'shvuda, if you just roasted them without salting them, shari and mutter because made it dayiv. Achtinu gurmi, but you put them on coals. Pligabar Rav Acha v'Ravina chadozo v'chachari manda aser matzvah samis or manda shari mishav shoyiv, exactly like the previous machlokes. And the same thing is v'chein mizraki, these arteries. Chatchei u'malchei, I feel like they're shari. Talinu b'shvuda, beis hashchitul t'tzoy shari. If the beis hashchit is pointed down, then we'll say it's mutter because made of dayiv. The dam will run right out. Achzeh gurmi, if you put it on coals, Pligabar Rav Acha Ravina chadozo v'chachari manda aser because it's matzvah samis or manda shari mishav shav v'hilchasa mishav shav. Halacha l'maisa, we passed on the kula that the fire will draw the blood out, and all of these three things are going to be allowed to be eaten, even though they were roasted on coals. And I guess we could stop here. We went over a little bit, but at least we finished all of it. Everybody, have a wonderful, wonderful day.
You too.